Elijah Grayson had always been a man of precision. As the clockmaker of the quaint town of Ravenswick, he was known for his meticulous craftsmanship. His shop, a narrow, cobblestone-fronted building on the edge of the town square, was filled with the rhythmic ticking of clocks of all shapes and sizes. It was a comforting symphony, one that gave structure to the days of those who passed through his doors. But Elijah's life was far from structured. Beneath his calm, methodical demeanor was a man haunted by his inability to control time. His wife Clara had died in a tragic accident 5 years ago, and he had been late by mere minutes to prevent it. Since then, Elijah had become obsessed with the idea of mastering time. Late one dreary afternoon, as rain slicked the cobblestone streets outside, a peculiar package arrived. It was wrapped in weathered brown paper and tied with fraying twine. The handwriting on the label was almost illegible, save for the words, "For the timekeeper of Ravenswick." There was no return address. Curiosity outweighed caution as Elijah untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside lay a pocket watch unlike any he had ever seen. Its face was a shimmering black, almost liquid in appearance, and the hands seemed to move against the natural flow of time, ticking backward in smooth, deliberate motions. Inscribed on its back were the words, "To hold time is to hold power. Use it wisely." Elijah's fingers trembled as he traced the inscription. The craftsmanship was immaculate, surpassing anything he had ever created or repaired. He brought the watch closer to his ear, expecting the faint tick-tock of its mechanism, but it was utterly silent. That night, unable to resist the lure of the watch, Elijah wound its delicate crown. At first, nothing seemed to happen. He glanced at the clocks around his shop, their hands continuing their steady march forward. Disappointed, he slipped the watch into his pocket and prepared to close the shop. But as he turned to extinguish the gas lamps, he noticed something strange. The flame of the nearest lamp had frozen mid-flicker, its light casting an unmoving shadow on the wall. Outside the window, raindrops hung suspended in the air like tiny glass beads. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The entire world had come to a halt, except for him. He stepped outside, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. A woman across the square, mid-step with her umbrella raised, was as still as a statue. A cart pulled by a pair of horses stood frozen, their hooves inches above the ground. Elijah reached out and touched one of the raindrops. It clung to his finger like dew before vanishing into nothingness. "Incredible," he whispered, his voice the only sound in the silence. He felt a surge of exhilaration. For the first time since Clara's death, he had control. Time, the elusive force he had longed to master, was now his to command. Over the next few days, Elijah experimented with the watch, learning its peculiarities. He discovered that, as long as he held it, time remained frozen. Releasing the watch's crown allowed the world to resume its natural flow, as if nothing had happened. At first, he used his newfound power sparingly, a minute stolen here, an hour there, to fix a clock or complete a task. But as his confidence grew, so did his ambition. Yet the watch was not without its peculiarities. Each time he used it, Elijah felt an odd sensation, as though unseen eyes were watching him. It was a faint prickling unease that he dismissed as paranoia. But then the shadows began to move. One evening, as Elijah roamed the frozen streets of Ravenswick, he noticed something out of place. The shadows cast by the lampposts and buildings seemed darker, thicker, almost alive. They shifted subtly, crawling along the edges of his vision. He turned quickly, but nothing was there. The stillness pressed in around him, heavier than before. Back in his shop, Elijah locked the door and drew the curtains. The flickering gaslight cast elongated shadows that danced across the walls. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by his isolation. But deep down, he knew better. The watch began to haunt his dreams. He saw visions of a vast, timeless void where the shadows writhed and whispered his name. When he awoke, the sensation of being watched lingered. Despite his unease, Elijah couldn't resist the watch's power. It was intoxicating, and he convinced himself that he could learn to control it, to bend time to his will without consequence. But the shadows had other plans. One night, as Elijah sat at his workbench, tinkering with the watch, he felt the air around him grow cold. The shop's familiar ticking sounds fade into an oppressive silence. He turned, heart pounding, and saw them for the first time. In the stillness, dark figures moved with unnatural fluidity. They had no distinct form, shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a draft. Their presence sent a chill down his spine. What are you?" Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures did not respond, but they moved closer, their amorphous shapes pressing against the edges of the lamplight. Panic surged through Elijah as he clutched the watch. Desperate, he wound it backward, and the world resumed its motion. The figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Elijah's hands trembled as he slumped against the workbench. The realization was undeniable. The watch's power came at a price. The shadows were not figments of his imagination. They were real, and they were drawn to him. As dawn broke, Elijah stared at the watch, its black face glinting ominously in the morning light. He had sought to master time, but now it seemed time was mastering him. The shadows were waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the stillness. And Elijah knew that as long as he held the watch, they would never stop. Elijah Grayson sat in the dim glow of his shop, the watch heavy in his hand. The rhythmic ticking of the surrounding clocks offered no comfort. Each sound reminded him of the power he now wielded, and the danger it brought. The shadows, he realized, were not just passive observers. They had a purpose, though he dared not imagine what it might be. Determined to understand the watch's origins, Elijah delved into research. He pored over dusty tomes in Ravenswick's library, consulted old maps, and even sought out stories from the town's oldest residents. But the watch's craftsmanship was unlike anything described in the annals of horology. Its inscription, however, hinted at something ancient and arcane. "To hold time is to hold power," he muttered to himself, running his fingers over the watch's surface. What power? And why me? The answers came in fragments. In the library, he stumbled upon a journal belonging to a long-deceased historian named Alaric Vane. One passage stood out. There exists legend of a timekeeper's artifact, said to grant dominion over time itself, but such power is not freely given. The artifact's bearer becomes a beacon, drawing the attention of those who dwell beyond time's reach. Their intentions remain unknown, but their presence is a harbinger of doom. The words sent a shiver through Elijah. He closed the journal, his mind racing. If the watch truly made him a target, he needed to find a way to protect himself. But how could he defend against creatures that existed outside the bounds of time? That evening, Elijah tested the watch's limits. He froze time and ventured further than ever before, leaving the safety of Ravenswick. As he walked along the still countryside, he noticed subtle changes. The air grew colder, and the shadows, always at the edge of his vision, grew bolder. They no longer lingered passively. They shifted and darted as if testing his resolve. In a clearing, he saw them more clearly than ever. The shadowy figures had begun to coalesce, their forms taking on a semblance of humanity. One stepped forward, its face an indistinct blur, yet its presence radiated malevolence. "Leave the watch," it hissed, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "It is not yours to wield." Elijah backed away, clutching the watch tightly. "What do you want? Why are you following me?" The figure tilted its head, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You have disrupted the balance. Return what was stolen, or face the void." Before Elijah could respond, the shadow surged forward. Panic gripped him as he wound the watch, desperate to escape. Time resumed with a deafening rush, and Elijah found himself back in his shop, gasping for breath. The encounter left him shaken, but it also fueled his determination. The watch held secrets, and he needed to uncover them before the shadows claimed him. The next day, Elijah sought out Margaret Holloway, the town's eccentric historian and rumored occultist. If anyone knew about the artifact, it would be her. Margaret's cottage, tucked away on the outskirts of Ravenswick, was cluttered with books, artifacts, and strange symbols etched into the walls. A watch that freezes time, you say? Margaret's eyes gleamed with curiosity. Such objects are rare, dangerous. Where did you find it? Elijah hesitated. It was sent to me. No sender, just appeared. Margaret's expression darkened. Then it chose you. Such artifacts have a will of their own. But beware, Mr. Grayson. The shadows you speak of are not merely guardians. They are enforcers, ensuring the artifact's power is not misused. How do I stop them? Elijah asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Margaret shook her head. You cannot stop them. Your only hope is to relinquish the watch. But even then, the damage may already be done. Elijah's resolve hardened. He couldn't let go of the watch, not yet. There had to be another way. As he left Margaret's cottage, Elijah felt the shadows gathering once more. Their presence was growing stronger, their movements more deliberate. He realized he was running out of time. If he didn't act soon, the shadows would consume him, and the watch's secrets would remain buried forever. But Margaret's cryptic warnings wouldn't leave him. That night, Elijah froze time and began experimenting anew, moving deeper into Ravenswick's outskirts. He hoped to uncover why the shadows had become increasingly hostile. At the edge of the village's woods, he found something unexpected. An old, overgrown stone circle. The strange carvings etched into the weathered rocks mirrored the patterns engraved on the watch. Could this place be connected to the watch's origin? Elijah stepped into the circle's center, clutching the watch tightly. The air grew colder, and the forest stillness pressed down on him. When he wound the watch again, the shadows emerged in force, their forms more defined and their intent unmistakable. They began to circle him, a silent, menacing procession. "What do you want from me?" Elijah shouted, his voice cracking. One shadow, taller than the rest, stepped forward. Its flickering face seemed to smirk as it whispered, "Not you. It." Elijah realized with dawning horror that the watch wasn't a gift. It was a trap. Whatever power it held, it wasn't meant to aid him. It was meant to claim him. The revelation struck Elijah like a physical blow. He staggered backward, clutching the watch as though it might shield him from the encroaching shadows. The taller figure's voice echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain. "Not you. It." "What do you mean?" he demanded, though his voice wavered. "Why me? Why this?" The shadow's reply was slow, deliberate. "You sought to master time, mortal, but time is not a servant. It is a master. The watch binds you to it, and through you, it feeds." Elijah's grip tightened. He shook his head, refusing to believe what he was hearing. "Number. This is my tool. My second chance." The shadow figures began to close in, their forms undulating like waves of ink. The circle's stones glowed faintly, as though they too were coming alive. "Your chance has ended," the tall figure intoned. "Surrender the watch and spare yourself, or be consumed." Panic coursed through Elijah's veins, but with it came resolve. He had lost Clara. He had spent years mourning, years wishing for a way to undo his failure. And now that he had the power to shape time itself, he would not give it up without a fight. "If you want it, he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "Come and take it." The shadows surged forward, their forms merging into a swirling maelstrom of darkness. Elijah wound the watch frantically, freezing time around him. The figures halted mid-lunge, their outlines blurred and distorted. For a moment, it seemed he had won. But then the watch began to glow. Its face burned with an otherworldly light, the backward-moving hands spinning faster and faster. Elijah felt a searing pain in his chest, as though the watch were pulling something from within him. The shadows, though frozen, began to vibrate, their forms destabilizing as the light grew brighter. Elijah fell to his knees, clutching the watch as the pain intensified. Visions flooded his mind. Clara's face, the moment of her death, the years of solitude that followed. He saw himself winding the watch for the first time, and the shadows stirring in response. He realized, too late, that the watch had been feeding on him all along, on his grief, his obsession, his desire to control the uncontrollable. "You are not its master," the tall figure's voice echoed in his mind. "You are its vessel." With a final, desperate act, Elijah hurled the watch into the center of the glowing circle. The moment it left his hand, the pain ceased, and time resumed with a deafening rush. The shadows let out a collective howl, their forms dissolving into nothingness, as the watch struck the ground. The light from the circle flared, blinding in its intensity. When it faded, the watch was gone. The stones were cold and lifeless once more, and the forest was silent. Elijah collapsed to the ground, his body trembling. The weight of the watch was gone, but so was the power he had wielded. He felt empty, hollow, as though a part of him had been ripped away. Yet for the first time in years, he also felt free. He stumbled back to Ravenswick, the morning sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. As he entered his shop, the familiar ticking of the clocks greeted him. It was a sound he had taken for granted, but now it felt like a gift. Elijah knew he would never forget the watch, nor the price he had paid for his obsession. But as he sat at his workbench, surrounded by the comforting rhythm of time's passage, he realized that some things were never meant to be controlled. And in the stillness of the shop, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper lingered. Tick, tock,